that came up, and then I just also wanted to bring us as a group so that like if there are questions, you wanted to ask, we'll give you an opportunity to do that. So let me see what we got. I'll share my screen. All right. So the first thing, I kind of like generated an error that I want you to know how to debug. Yeah. So let's do this. So so this Lambda handler thing, this is like the main, like almost like our run function, right? And if you think back to like the first semester, it kicks everything else off. And the idea is that we should be able, like, you think of this as a service, right? Meaning, when people say service, it is vague, but we just mean like it's independent, and it has, provided an input, performs a function, and has an output. All right. So for us, the input is like the event, right? This dictionary that we provide. So it's like if I specify, and it also should probably like add user value. Right? This kind of goes hand in hand. But what does this service do? Well, provided like an origin, destination, and departure date, it will find the flights on that day, and save them to S3. Right? Like that's what this does, our extract and load. So to that point, like I think it works, right? Provide an input, it performs some sort of operation, has an output, and it adds user value. Like we get back that data and they're saved for us. So if we call this thing, let's call it Python 3-i main.py, and then I can, just define a context, define the event, and now pass that data through my Lambda handler. And this will, right, you can see I'm printing out some stuff. So I'm printing out, like, here's the origin, destination, departure date, and then we generate the file name, and then here I print out the file name just so I can log it. So you can see that here, the New York City 2023 0802. All right. And then I'm purposely breaking here. So notice, let's just read this error. We can go back through this later, but let's handle this error first. So we're breaking in extract load writer line 6 right to S3. So sorry, line 16. So I can just click on this, I hope. It takes me right there. We can see this is my main function, meaning that search and upload function. It gives me the origin, the destination, the destination file, and the departure date. And then we use that data to hit the API. We use the file name to then write to S3, right? And we're getting an issue here, right, with the write to S3. Mainly like this put object thing. We're getting an error with like access denied, which means, something's going wrong with probably like my AWS user. So how do I debug that? So I didn't see a ton of people run into this, but I'm pretty sure like this is a typical error that can occur when you're performing this type of stuff. So I want to review how would you debug this. So the first thing I would do is be like, who is my user? Like, which user am I? Right? If I'm getting access denied, like, who am I as a user? And then to figure that out, I would basically ask ChatGPT. You see what I asked about. I'm like, how can I find the AWS user using Boto3? And then it gives me, this code, and it gives me this ARN thing. But I was like, but I would just want to find out like the username, So I said, what about the username? It says, okay, I'm sorry. Here's the username stuff. So what I would do at this point now is I can just, go to my code. We can exit out of here. We can do Python 3, and we just paste this stuff in here, and it tells me my user is code-along user, right? So at this point, right, so we're code-along user. If we, what we can do at this point is basically look for, the permissions on code-along user. So for that, I can go to IAM, users, see the different, access points. And we can see we only have read-only access, right? So we're not able to, like, put any objects, so that makes sense, right? So what's next is then, is then either to change this, or you can also see like where is this actually being set. So that's being set in your home directory. So the tilde is your home directory. All right. You can see it actually for me is like users Jeffrey Katz, but when it's the tilde, right, it's the home directory. And then we can go to .aws, and then you can take a look at who the main user is if you look at credentials. So in the credentials file, that is what has like your access key, secret access key, and then the default. Here we have like this square brackets. This is the default. That means that's the user I'm going to be logged in. All right. So I must be logged in as code along user, and really what I want to be logged in is someone who has like admin access. The reason, we could either add the permissions to give myself S3 put access, but the issue is like eventually I'm going to want to like use Boto3 to invoke my Lambda function too. Also, we're going to need S3 to upload to Dockerize, not to Dockerize, but to take your Docker image and to push it to ECR. So for those things, right, you're going to need admin access. All right. So all I'll do to change this is change default, make default like this guy. It's not this guy because I don't want to show you my admin access keys, but something. If I just change default over here, and then maybe I'll switch the original one to code along user. That will mean when I log in, now this will be the user, and ideally this user has admin access. All right, so let me just stop sharing for a second and pause this. All right, and I'll keep sharing. So, all right, so now let's try it again, right? So all I did was I changed my credentials file, right? So that I changed who has default. And then I just want to confirm that change occurs. So I go to Python 3. I can copy this code again and just paste it back in there. And now you can see it's changed, right? It used to be code along user. Now it's AWS access. So that feels better. And then I can run this. Sorry, we're doing the wrong thing. Let's run the Lambda handler again. So that would be in the main.py file. And let's just run this. So what I'll probably do is change the departure date. Right? Just to make sure, I just want to make sure that if I change the departure date or change some of these parameters, then I can test a before and after and make sure that my function call actually wrote to S3, etc. So let's do main.py. I'll paste in this context, event, and the Lambda handler. All right, so you can see we're writing to this file August 12th. This looks right. It's taking a minute. That's fine. It takes a second to hit this. And this is returning back the data. Let's see where we're getting this from. So this is in my main.py function. I'm returning the response, and the returning of the response is the return value from the search and upload, and the return value of search and upload is this. All right, and now so you can see why we did it this way. I just want to make sure, okay, this is the file I'm uploading to, and then this is the flight data, or an example of some of the flight data I'm uploading. Right? And then you can look at, we could have always, taken this, stored it as a variable, and searched through it. The other thing you should probably do at this point is actually go to S3 and go to, I think it's called flights, Amadeus flights. This should be in raw, I believe. And now what I'm looking for is that August 12th, 8/12. So here it is. Right, and I can also see, look, June 25th at right around now, right? So this feels about right in terms of the last modified, and then I can download the data. And what I want to look at is it shouldn't just have, you see, it's saving all the data. Like it's just dumping the response from the API. I'm not transforming it at all. I'm dumping the entire response into the S3 bucket. Okay? And so at that point, like my service, quote unquote, right, performs this function where I'm providing origin, destination, departure date. It hits the API and then just saves the data. Questions about anything with this, like any of the code, in this first portion?
Jeff, I don't remember if you ever discussed the .get method
Oh,
or
okay.
Lambda.
Yeah, this is for a dictionary. So if you have, right, I think you guys know this, right? If you have, but let's just review it real fast. So if I have a dictionary event and I do, let's say like, the reason why I did it this way was like, let's say somebody forgets to pass through the origin, or like I'm having a hard time passing through the origin, I can do event.get, and when there is no key value pair, right, like let's do this, we'll do let's do event.foo, right, and it gives me a key error. But if someone forgets to pass through the origin, if I do event.get foo, right, some key that's not there, it will return to be none, but it will not break. And then if you do event.get foo, right, that key is not there, this second value is what you want to return, right, as the default. So because there's no key here, we'll return this string. But when I when I have like event.get origin, and then I say return like Philadelphia, right? This, because there is an origin key, it actually just returns what's provided. See that? So that's what I'm doing here, is I'm saying, okay, if they don't provide the origin, set the default as NYC. They don't provide destination, set the default as Chicago. They don't provide a departure date string, set this as the default. Okay. One other thing to go through, I don't know if everyone did it this way. In my generate file name, like, I wanted to make sure that it's always a consistent string. So the way I do this is, let's say somebody, what I'm mainly concerned about with is the date time. So let's say, for example, someone passes through not 2 digits for the month, but just like 1 digit for the month. All right. Let's do that. Actually I can still be here. I have the generate file name in this file because I'm importing up top. So now if I pass through the origin, destination, let's just copy this stuff. Damn. Origin, destination, and departure date string. So I just set three dates. And now we do this, let's just change the departure date string. So so this is correct, but now let's change it to a format that's incorrect, like 2023/8/12. And now I pass through this generate file name function. All right, you can see it adds in the 08. That's very important, right? Because the only way that our two different Lambda functions communicate to one another is one guy writing to a file and the other guy reading from that file. So if the drop off is in the wrong location, it's going to break and it's annoying to debug. So I want to make sure, kind of regardless of the input that someone provides, I'm like kind of foolproofing it a little bit, right? I'm making it less brittle by saying, okay, even if you forget to provide the 08, I'm going to add it in there. How do I accomplish that? Basically all I do is, in the generate file name, I make sure we read in this string, the string of the date time, convert it to a date time object. So it starts as a string, this departure date, right, is a string. So it starts as a string. We pass it through and read it in as a datetime object, and then I spit it out. And when I spit it back out as a string, it will return the full 2 digits for the month. All right, that's all I'm doing. But that bit of like consistency helps. Other questions about this?
Is this double-digit date is for Lambda or for API itself? Because I think the API also won't run if you just pass one.
Yeah, it's for both. It's like I use this. I apply this policy or like this kind of formatting for both. You know, for this purpose, it's there to be less brittle, so that you're not like sometimes providing 2 digits and sometimes forgetting to. And then reading from the wrong spot. And then for the API, you need to provide 2 digits for the month.
So does that go back to a string then? Is that what that second one is?
Yeah, for here, now it returns back as a string in the format year, month, day. But I know that it will always be 2 digits for the month. So the main function, right, is this search and upload. Search the flights, write to S3, and then just get back some data. You can see here I'm reading from the bucket, right? Destination file, blah, blah. The only thing probably, this keeps annoying me, is I would move this to be an environmental variable, right? Like I should probably have this in the .m file and also have, read this from settings, you know? Because like this kind of like global like configuration thing, right? It's global configuration. I should just put it that way, and that way you don't have to keep just typing in this word. If you want to change the bucket name, you can just easily change the bucket name.
So
right. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I was just wondering, like, what was the purpose of putting the destination file as an argument in the function?
Yeah.
Or we like generate.
Right, already generated. I get what you're saying. It's a really good question because it's like, it feels weird. Like, so let me just highlight that question for a second. I would agree that like, if you think about what this Lambda handler does, what does it do? Well, it just searches and it basically just like, this is what it does. It searches and uploads. So like generating the file name feels like it's given too much credit for like a small step, you know? Like it does, this is supposed to be like top level, what's occurring. So we search for the data and we upload it to S3. So then why do we do the generate file name here? One is that I think that I found this most useful in like the way that they talk to each other, like in the, hey, this is kind of a valuable, this is the way that my other Lambda function is going to communicate with the output from here. Like we're going to be reading from this file. So at that point, just to be able to see this thing, you know, just to be able to print it out, view it in the log, and maybe like put a breakpoint here and make sure that this is like correct. And then the second step is get the data. So in that way, you kind of see the handoff, right? And I got this same kind of issue. I was almost going to put this in Airflow. You know, I was almost going to pass through the file name so that, you know, you can kind of, this is the one component that not only, you know, that reaches outside, that the other Lambda function is dependent on, right? It's dependent on the Lambda function. So I almost was even going to say like, all right, let's generate the file name in Airflow, you know, in the kind of the orchestrator, and that way, you know, both functions know what that file name is, right? Like it gets its importance because both functions are dependent upon it. So in terms of the practical reason, right, like now I get to log it like directly in, like once we Dockerize this, right, this becomes harder to see, but this is for like debugging purposes and basically because it's the other Lambda is dependent upon it, this becomes an important output.
Another question. So this is like starting to be a pretty big code base, not like super big, obviously, but at what point do you decide, hey, I just want to use a different repo? Because we have different Docker containers, we have like different, there's all like performing a split function, but use it also.
Yeah, I do get what you're saying. I think that's a good question too. So right now, the way this is structured is we have extract load, load to Postgres, right? We have these three, but it's not even that. This ETL, and then we have Airflow. I say the main thing I would consider is like, are different teams using this? Like, is it that one team is just dealing with ETL, and then it feels like it's or one team is just dealing with extract and load, and then another team is doing this, and like we are, it's like essentially a different project, If, however, like these things, it feels like I'm navigating throughout this code base and they are more tightly coupled, right? What you'd think of as like more tightly coupled, then then I keep it in the same repository. In this case, at this point, they're small enough. Like sometimes they get so large and end up, and also like end up being their own like world that, okay, then you break it out into a separate repository. But in this case, it feels like one, it's small enough, and two, they're dependent enough, right? These different tasks, the fact that Airflow ties them together, that it belongs in the same repository. Right? They're also at this point part of the same project. If they started being used by, say, like separate projects, right? If you're like, well, wait a second, like the data science team is using this extract and load thing, and when it looks at it, it doesn't want to have to see all this crap about like the data warehouse, right? Like that's at a certain point, maybe it's confusing for it. Then maybe you start to pull it out, right? Another consideration is like just like if you have to like constantly rebase, if you have these merge issues, right? Well then, and maybe like the data science team doesn't want to have to deal with that, right? Like maybe then you keep it smaller. But I typically like having things in a fair, like this is not so bad. Like I would say even if you hit like a few thousand files, I would probably like that's still not bad for keeping it in the same repository, because the nice thing about it is you get to see everything, you know what I mean? Like it's not as hidden. You get to just like open up your code base and you see the whole flow and that can navigate stuff. Cool. Other questions? So yeah, I think that I really want to go back to that first question. Like, I like the idea of thinking about this main.py or like our Lambda function as like telling a story, right? Like this is kind of like, you can say I even separated it, like get the inputs and then what are the main steps? Really the main step is search and upload, but I guess this gets promoted a bit because, right, the Lambda, our other Lambda function is dependent upon it. Right, so it's a little awkward, I would say. All right. As for, so we covered, debugging AWS. We covered some of this structure. In terms of, some things came up about Docker. The first thing that came up was, okay, so I've done this a couple times where what I'm doing here is I'm first copying requirements.txt, then installing requirements.txt, and then copying over the rest of my files. You guys see that, right? So it's like for this extract and load, we have a Docker file in here, and the way we're doing this is first deal with requirements.txt and installing it. So why do we do that? So the reason why is all about like caching, right? Like when you do the Docker build -t, the name of the image, extract, dot, it builds this in layers, right? And if this bottom layer doesn't change, let's say like nothing here changes, it will just reuse it. It won't go through the steps again. However, once one of these layers changes, like let's say this one changes, it will rebuild every successive layer. Okay? Right? It's building this up in layers. Once it sees a change, it will, even if nothing changes in these layers, it will rebuild it. So typically what you do is you build the requirements, and the requirements, really it's about installing the requirements for early on. Why do you do that? Because this is what takes a while, all right? And also, it does not change very often. It's not like every day you add a new library to your code base, but it is every day that you change your code base, right? Like change the code base that's in source. Like you're adding code every single day, right? Ideally, a lot of times a day. So we can, when we rebuild, not have to reinstall all of our libraries, right? And this, we're using 5, but there could be like 100 that we're using. So we could not reinstall all of our libraries and skip that part because we're just caching that. And then it just sees the change here. And these changes take like half a second to rebuild this. This takes like, 4 or 5 seconds, which is annoying. So most of the time what you'll see is people first do the copy requirements of text, then install it, and that way this layer is cached, and then they'll, if they change this, it's not a big deal because it doesn't take hardly any time to update the code. Did that make any sense? Yeah? All right. Another question that came up was like, what does this command main lambda handler do? So this is for lambda. Maybe that feels obvious, but this is for your lambda function. What does this thing do? When you deploy, right, ultimately, remember what we're going to have to do is get this lambda function. It's Dockerized. We'll go to our lambda function. I forget what mine is called. Maybe something about flights. I don't know if I think I pulled it down, so it's not up there. But let's do this one. Okay. So this is going to have, ultimately, it's going to be attached to an image. You can see it has this configuration of main.lambda handler. What does this mean? This is when there is an event that is called, right? Like this whole thing is event driven. Like when we either set a test event or like there's a, some sort of, we invoke our lambda function, whatever, what part of the code base do you want to call? We want to call the main file lambda handler. So here you're specifying for the lambda function, what is the function that you need to invoke when you receive an event. So it could be any, like you could specify anything in here, like we could have specified something in this file and we would have changed it to file writer dot generate file name. And now every time an event is received, it will try to call this function. You're going to have to change this so that it only takes context and event, or event and context, but you can specify like this is what I want to be called when there's an event that gets received. But really for us, what we're doing is we're saying when you receive an event, so when I build this image, we're going to specify this guy in the main.py function, this lambda handler function. We're going to specify this as the function to call when you receive an event. Okay, so that's what this Docker file is about. That's what this command is about. Yeah. So this is just for Lambda. Questions about that, right? So with Docker, we talked about caching, right? And then we also this is really more about the way Lambda works, is that you have to specify, another way of, it is like a callback function. You have to specify the callback function, right? Like when you get an event, do this. Then the last thing that came up was like Docker Compose, and would we use that instead of, we'll have this extract and load service, we'll have this transform and load service. So now we have 2 Docker images. Why not use Docker Compose? we cannot use Docker Compose, right? Like it's not going to work. The reason why is, right, we have the EL service. Ugh, I cannot write EL. Okay, so we have this EL service that's on one Lambda. Like this is a separate EC2 machine, basically. We're running space in an EC2. And our transforming load, right? Here we're running space on a second. It's my L2. We're running space on a separate EC2 machine, potentially, probably, you know. So these things are like totally separate. My L2 and my L1, these two code bases, in terms of how they're deployed, right? So this is on one computer. This is probably on a separate computer. Docker Compose is only for when you have multiple images on the same computer, right? And you need them to like talk directly to one another, right? So this is for like, you know, when we had it on our laptop and maybe we needed these things to talk to another. Or you remember like we had one of these guys talk to like our database and we had PG and that was a separate service, right? So there was all on one computer and we're just making it easy for these separate services to talk to one another. In this case, right, these are on separate computers, right? Because we're deploying this to a Lambda, we're deploying this to a separate Lambda. Two, they're not talking to each other, right? Like there's nothing where transform and load is asking for something from extract and load. The only way they talk to each other is extract and load dumps this into an S3, I forget how you draw a bucket, right? Into one S3 bucket, and then this thing, transform and load, will read from that S3 bucket. So really, like this is the only, it's like a drug deal, right? There's the drop-off location, this is the pickup location, right? So that's the only form of communication. Otherwise, incommunicado, as it should be. All right. So does this make sense, right? Here's they can have communication. Cool. Okay, so this, and then the other thing I'd say is like, let's just build this. So the reason why I had you do this using this Python 3 as the base image is because it's easier to just get a feedback loop, right? So docker build dash t, we'll call this extract dot docker. So what I had to do this lots of times, like debug inside Docker to make sure like are all my files there. I forgot to move over the .m file. Not moving over the .n file meant everything worked except that I was not getting a response back from Amadeus, which makes sense, right? Because I'm not passing through my client and I'm like, why am I not getting a response back? And it took me like an hour to figure out it's because I forgot to move over my .m file. So you know, like, so anyway, how did I figure that out? Well, I built the image, I bashed into Docker, right? And the only way you can use bash in Docker, well, this one here, this just doesn't have bash, so you can't use it. So, all right, so let's just do that real fast. Docker run, this was extract -it, and then remember, if I call bash, that will override the default command, right? So I don't even have to worry about the fact that this is only for Lambda and I'm not using Lambda at this function right now because I'm overriding the default command. So I'll bash in here. And then I forget where I put it. Is it in like user source? Something like that? Do you guys remember? Or was it var? Yeah, maybe it was in var local. Yeah, and then here's my requirements.txt, here's my source, right? Like I don't love, like I should probably maybe make it like a code base folder for this so it's not all mixed in with everything else. But you can see here's my files, and then here's my .m file as well. And then the other thing you'll have to do is So if you look at pwd tilde, you can see this is tilde, like let's cd to tilde, and then type pwd, so it's /root. This is where we're in a container, we're in it, right? It's an isolated container. So in order to call our function, we're gonna need our AWS credentials in there. So to do that, we can do a bind mount into an AWS. We basically need that AWS directory I showed you before in the home folder, right, which is where the tilde thing. So I gave you the code for doing that, but I just wanted to explain it. Man, can I not exit? There you go. So yeah, the code for doing that, hopefully now it makes a little sense, is, right, this is bind mounting from my local.aws folder to, right, and this is like my tilde, right, my home directory, user Jeffrey Katz, to /root. This is the Docker images home folder, happens to be /root.aws, right? So I'm moving my credentials, or not moving it, but bind mounting, like putting a portal essentially to read from my laptop into the root.aws folder. It will create one if it doesn't exist, and then using bash to then, you know, basically connect to the terminal in the container. Yeah, does that make sense? So now you can like call, if you want to, ideally, okay, so here I'm right here. There's my .m. If I look at if I do an ls on tilde, I see the .aws folders there, and what that means is I'm pretty good. I should be able to do Python 3-i main.py from here. Maybe not. Oh, there you go. Right, and now that main.py file, let's just exit this for a second. Cat main.py. That main.py file, right, has all my code, and so I should be able to, you know, Python 3 main.py context event. You know, we just want to test it out from here. Let's change this to 13 square bracket, and then do the lambda handler. So generate the file name. We'll see if we get back in a response. What I'm mainly checking on is I want to make sure, okay, like this .aws thing worked, and it looks like it did, right? So we generate this file. Here's my flight data, and then you probably should go to S3 to confirm that if you go to raw, and then now I'm looking for 813 generated this time. That looks about right, 6 seconds ago. And then we download the data and just confirm that it's there. So now this is the second step, right? We Dockerized it. The only other thing I need to do is now go change this thing and then probably rebuild it. Oh, I'm installing my Docker container. Just type exit. I think that works. Okay. All right, and now I should just rebuild it. Docker build. All right, because I'm rebuilding it because now we have this Lambda that I can now deploy to AWS. And just remember that I'm using a Mac that has an M1 or M2 on it, so that's why I have this -ARM64. If you're using a Mac that does not have that on it, or you're not using a Mac at all, you don't need and you should not have this ARM64. And then also when you move over to serverless, you should not have this either, right? I don't believe. You can just remove that line. All right, I know I'm showing you too much. All right, questions about this part? You know?
Just a sanity check for the lambda function. The testing for main.py implies that we're only supposed to return the first 3 flights, right? Not everything?
Yeah, so good question. And this threw a few people off. When you, what I'm saying is like write all the data to S3, you know, and I guess this is what threw people off too, but just then read that data back, and this is really just for logging. You know, I could have had you return everything, but it's too much to look at, you know, in your terminal. So what I'm saying is write everything to S3, the entire file, like all the output. Just write it directly there. Like you can see, you get the data, and then we literally just write it all. And but then just for logging purposes, in terms of what I want you to return, show me the file that you wrote to, and just show me the first like 3 records. That's the idea.
Gotcha. It's just in the tests file, in the main.py test, the assert function says like it calls on flight data, and then 0 at the very bottom for the assert. It says flight data and then 0. So that's implying that after we cleaned it up, we added that key value flight data that doesn't exist in the raw data. You know.
I think it's because, yeah, so this threw people. You could change this to data. Yeah, you can change this to data. I think this might come up in other places too. It worked for me, but because I'm like, what we're doing, actually, I don't even know why it worked for me. I'm reading the data from the bucket file name, bucket data. You're right, it should just be data, I think. Yeah. Okay, cool. All right. Feel free to take a break, but we only have till 5:30, and then we'll, you know, move on to the next thing.